Hello, and thank you for joining me here on the I Am Barabbas podcast. We are continuing on in our study with our weekly Torah readings, and our passages for this week are come from Genesis chapter 44, verse 18 through chapter 47, verse 27, Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 15 through 28, and an interesting passage out of Luke chapter 6, verses 9 through 16. So we left off last week with a bit of a cliffhanger. We had Joseph uh, framing his brother Benjamin for stealing silver, his silver cup or his goblet or whatever translation you want to use for that. It's just an expensive item that belonged to Joseph. Joseph's like, wouldn't you know that someone like me would know that you took it? A diviner like me, he was known as being someone who spoke to God, someone who got revelation from God, and so he was telling his brothers in that sense, like, wouldn't you know that I would figure out that you took my stuff? And of course they were flabbergasted by the whole thing because they didn't take anything. It was all part of a plan that Joseph enacted with the help of his the people that worked for him. They put that cup into Benjamin's sack, and so they look through that stuff and they find it there. And so Joseph's like, okay, well, this guy is going to be my slave now, pointing to his younger brother. And that's where we left off last week. And as we pick up this week, we get to see that what Joseph was doing, he wasn't just trying to set up his brother or set up a way for him to keep his brother with him. He was he was putting out a test for his other brothers. He wanted to know if they had changed or not. And if you remember, with the story of Joseph, the theme of it is that he was his father's favorite son, and he really didn't care that his brothers would hate him for what he did. Like, he would tell on his brothers, and he would report to his dad what they were doing, and they knew he did it. He knew they knew he did it, and it's like, I don't really care. I'm going to do what I need to do to stay up near dad, and if like, be dad's favorite. If this is what dad likes me to do, I'm going to do this for him. And you see that play out with everywhere he goes, with Potiphar in his house, and then in the prison with the warden, and then ultimately the Pharaoh. He knows how to play the game. He knows how to stay up near the top, as high near the top as he can, with power. And but because of the fact that he did that, and the fact that Jacob loved his son all the more, and they could feel like that Jacob loved Joseph more than he loved them. There was jealousy, there was resentment, there was anger, there was hatred, and there was the dreams about them worshiping him. And at that point, they were like, "You're done." And they betrayed him. They were going to kill him. Instead, they sold him off as a slave. And so, what Joseph wants to know is, are these guys the same guys that sold me into slavery? He wants to know, like, am I going to tell them that I forgive them? Am I going to reconcile with them? Are we going to restore this relationship? And in order to do so, Joseph wants to make sure that they've changed. And so he creates a situation where Benjamin, his brother, which we've looked at throughout the passages, we know that Joseph and Benjamin were seen as two different sons. They were the only sons of Rachel, the one that Jacob actually loved, the one that Jacob wanted to marry. All the other sons belonged to Leah or their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. And so Joseph definitely had this special affection affinity for Joseph and Benjamin alone. And so Joseph wants to know, again, are these brothers of mine, have they changed? Do they now care about what happens to dad? You remember when they sold Joseph and they concocted the lie that Joseph was killed by a wild animal or something, and then Jacob mourned. They try to console their father, and they couldn't. And that attempt to try to console Jacob seemingly had a big effect on Judah, as he then left where they were all living together and started his own life and family and everything else, before he was forced to go back because of the famine. And it's Judah that we see here who's stepping up as a leader. Remember that the two oldest, or the three oldest, have kind of been disqualified as leaders, in Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. And so Judah steps up here, and he's the one that takes the initiative to save his brother's life. So Joseph concocts a test. Are these men of mine that are my brothers, are they the same? Are they loyal to dad? Have they changed? what exactly is going on with them before he can reveal himself to them. And so that's why he concocts this test. And so Judah approaches. That's the title of this week's reading. And he drew near. And the idea of reconciliation, forgiveness, is really the whole theme of this week's reading. And what is a big part of that is the offender coming near to the offended. And so we have that with Judah. Remember, Judah was the one who came up with the plan to sell Joseph, which was good because he didn't want to murder his brother, but still he's the one that came up with that plan to sell him rather than save him, which Reuben was kind of trying to do if he could have had the opportunity to get back to Joseph before they did sell him. And so it's Judah who approaches here, and he retells the whole story, and he's telling the story about the father and about how much it would hurt his dad if they lost Benjamin. If they lost Benjamin, he says, like, my dad will surely die. And that's what he says in verse 27. Then your servant, my father, said to us, you yourselves know that my wife bore me 2 sons. And just the language there, Judah is admitting that they understand that for Jacob, like, these 2 sons are the most important. And if something happens to them, it says in verse 28, one went out from me, speaking of Joseph, saying one left and he was torn up and he hasn't been seen since. And if you take this one away from me, the accident happens and you'll bring my gray hair down to the evil of Sheol. So he's saying, I'm going to die. If something happens to Benjamin, I'm going to die. And so he's recounting that to Joseph and the whole story. And this is where he's stepping up and he's saying something different. He does something different than what he did with Joseph, right? With Joseph, he was willing to sell his brother, say, hey, listen, take Joseph, his 20 pieces of silver, or whatever it was, is a small amount of silver, and you can have him. Here, there's great cost that's coming at the family. Benjamin's going to be taken, and it's because of a lot of money that's owed, because of the assumption that he stole this silver cup, and Judah is not willing to sell his brother into slavery this time. This time he's willing to sell himself into that position. So he says, if I don't bring him back to you, he tells him, I'll bear the blame. So he's telling Joseph the promise he made to his dad. And so in verse 34, he says, how can I go up to my father and the boy is not with me? Else I must see the evil that will come upon my father. And so in verse 33, he says, so please let your servant remain as my Lord's slave in the boy's place. And so he's giving up his own life for his brother, and the reason why he's doing it is because he knows how important his brother is to his father, and he doesn't want his father to suffer any more than he already has. And this attitude is a reflection of a complete turnabout in the way that Judah and the rest of the brothers feel about their father and about their father's favorite kid. Because now Benjamin stepped into that role. Joseph's gone. That Benjamin stepped into the role as favorite child, because it's the only one that is of his one wife, which we read earlier. Like they just understood like this special relationship Jacob had with these 2 boys because of the special love he had for Rachel. And with Joseph, it led to jealousy, rage. Okay, we're going to betray our brother and sell him away. In this case with Benjamin, it's no, I'm going to give up my own life for my brother so that my father doesn't have to suffer anymore. He doesn't want his father to suffer again. And it's at that moment where Joseph he's already twice, broke, like had to cry and left. But here's where he's like, okay, everybody get out. And he wants to talk to his brothers. Why? Like I just said, this was a test. You look at like commentaries and rabbinic commentaries and Christian ones or whatever. Everyone understands that what Joseph did here was put together a test to see where his brother's loyalty, where the loyalty of his brothers belong, and whether or not they're the same guys that sold him into slavery. And if you remember, with the birth of his first son, he named the son in a way that indicated that he was forgiving everything that had happened to him. But in this test isn't about forgiveness. This test is about restoration and reconciliation, the reconciliation and restoration of a relationship. Forgiveness happened, then now it's like, okay, well, I forgave, but are we going to have a relationship moving forward? And so he concocted this test, and by asking to switch places, Judah shows that the brothers have indeed changed, and now Joseph is willing to reconcile with them and to restore that relationship. So he starts crying and he's telling them, I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? And the brothers are unable to answer because, of course, they're dismayed. They're just like, what is going on here? And at this moment, Joseph frames for them why he was able to forgive, and and why now he wants to reconcile with them. So the perspective of why he's forgiving comes to his understanding of how God intended to use this situation for a very specific purpose. And so despite the fact that it resulted in his suffering, he recognizes God's purpose in what he went through. And so from there he's able to forgive, and from there he's trying to console his brothers, and it has to do with the famine and everything else in verse 5. So don't be grieved, don't be angry in your own eyes, which really means don't be angry at yourself for what what you did to me. Like, don't keep holding yourself accountable. I know plenty of people, myself included, mess up, don't do something we should do. It's often times harder to forgive ourselves for what we've done than others. We could just be like, man, how could I do that? We can beat ourselves up, like, I was so dumb, I was such an idiot, how could I do that? I can, so on and so forth. And what he's trying to tell them is, let that go. Forgive yourself, let that go, and understand that it was God did everything that has happened here to preserve life. And whose life? The life of Jacob, his family, and all of us together. Why? Because there was going to be a famine, and it was going to be terrible, and God knew that. And so verse 8, so it wasn't you didn't send me here, but God. And Joseph isn't like just discounting everything his brothers did. He understands what they did to him and why they did what he did. That's why he concocts the test to see if they're the same. He wants to make sure that their hearts have changed before he reveals himself. I mean, he could order them to bring dad back. He could have kept Benjamin and said, well, listen, the only way I'm going to release Benjamin is if you bring, this younger boy, is if you bring your father back here, and then we can talk. And he could have manipulated it even further to get his dad there if he thought that his brothers were failing the test. And it seemed to him like his brothers still, were jealous of Benjamin and Rachel and Jacob and their special relationship. And so he could have gone that route, and he would have still probably taken care of them, but maybe not like, here's my son, here's my kids, and all the lovey-dovey stuff. In other words, the full reconciliation. But since they did pass the test, he can go beyond forgiveness into reconciliation and into restoration of the relationship. And so he invites them to go and tell dad about the fact that he's alive, and to bring him home, and or to bring Jacob there. And so he sets up this land for them to be able to stay in, this land of Goshen, which, is like a very fertile piece of land, apparently, like a part of a delta that belonging to the Nile. And you would think, well, in a famine, wouldn't this be like an important piece of land to keep for anybody? Like, anybody else would want to have this land as well. But as the story tells us, Egyptians thought of shepherds, people who take care of livestock, as abhorrent. Or they abhorred them, they hate them. Like, this is dirty, it's disgusting, I don't want to be near them, that kind of thing. And so Joseph's plan is, tell Pharaoh that you guys are shepherds, and that way they'll be like, okay, we don't want to mix with them, we want to keep them separate. And then they'll give you the land of Goshen, because the land of Goshen is like the one area that's fertile enough to take care of livestock. Human beings may be able to live in other places without water, and to figure out things at the Nile, and then grow seeds and everything else. We can do that as people, but animals need to feed off of the land. And so Goshen was going to be that place. And so Joseph knew this place would be the ideal place for them to also kind of live in, because it's going to continue to be watered by the Nile. And then the excuse for them being there could be because they're the ones taking care of the livestock, and the livestock need to be in that area to pasture, to feed, and everything else. So they're not in other words, they're not farming and growing vegetables and plants and everything else. They're taking care of livestock, and so that's why they need that that area. So they do that. They tell um, Pharaoh about this. First, Pharaoh sends Joseph and his family out to go get his father and come back. Notice that in verse 22, it says each of them he gave change of clothes, while Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 sets of clothes. It just I highlighted it because it's the opposite of how they sent Joseph away. When they sent Joseph away, they took his one like precious coat and they ripped it up and put animal's blood and they sold him for like 20 pieces of silver. Like you're gone, right? And yet now Joseph is sending them back home to go get dad and bring him back. And when he sends them off with a brand new set of clothes, and of course he gives way more money to his brother Benjamin and 5 sets of clothes, which we saw earlier, just like showing this outpouring of love towards his brother Benjamin. And so it's just an indication. I just thought it was cool the parallel there, like the way they sent him away and the way he's sending them away, completely different, right? Even the first time when they went back with so many provisions and silver, it just showed like his kindness and his heart and where he was and how he's different from they are, or at least how they were. They're told to not be anxious, and then they go to get Jacob when Jacob sees this as his heart went numb, for he didn't believe him. There's a lot of arguing about, not arguing, but just like debate about that phrase, whether he died and then he resurrected again, like he came back to life, or he just went into a coma. It's hard to understand. The language is just, some translations go numb, some say his heart stopped. Certainly not so much that he died. I mean, the way he wakes up is when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to pick him up, the spirit of the father of Jacob revived. So the way he like his heart kind of starts beating is when he sees everything there. But at first he was, freaked out, which is exactly what they were worried would happen, right? Judah said, like, if we come back without Benjamin, dad's going to die. So they get Jacob and they go back. And on the way, he stops at Beersheba. And please remember this always, like the whole thing with the promised land, right? God called Abraham to come to it. And then Abraham journeyed around. There was famine. He went to Egypt. You remember Isaac was told, don't go to Egypt with the famine. So he stayed in the area, went to Abimelech and started digging wells again. And then Jacob left the promised land to go stay with his uncle, and he ran away from home to do that. And then Esau left the promised land to set up in Mount Seir, and he wanted his brother to come with him, but Jacob was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And Jacob worked his way back into the land, and he stayed there. And so at the beginning of chapter 46, Jacob is worried, you know, should I be leaving this land? Like, this is the land that you promised to my father, or to my grandfather, to Abraham. And so he sends some sacrifices up to God, and so he's probably praying as he's sending up sacrifices and saying, should I be doing this? And God answers him in visions of the night and says, Jacob, Jacob. And he says, do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. I will turn you a great nation there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I myself I'll also most certainly bring you up. And Joseph will put his hands on your eyes. So he's telling him, yes, it's okay to leave. I know I told your dad not to go. I'm telling you it's okay to go, and then I will bring you guys back, and also you're going to see your son Joseph again. And so with that assurance from God, which is really cool to see, like Jacob have these moments of like the kind of obedience and praying to God and asking him for direction. And so he does that, and he gets his answer, and he goes on. And so when he goes on, he gets to Egypt, and he meets with his son, and he meets with his Pharaoh. They have the whole thing. They tell us a listing here of everybody who went there. I think that at the end there's like a tally of 70 people. And then in verse 28, it says that they go to Goshen, and the reason for that, again, is it mentioned earlier. Joseph set this up so that they could keep themselves separated from the rest of the Egyptians, using the Egyptians' hatred against them. Like, we're not going to mingle in with the Egyptians, but at the same time, we're also going to get the best land, because we're going to do the thing that Egyptians hate to do, and that's take care of livestock. So all of that combined together, they go to Goshen. We see the reunion of Joseph and Israel, and he's like, "Oh, I'm ready to die," which it's funny if like the elderly people, like they always say things like that, and it's like, oh gosh, don't say that, because now what if you do die? Like, uh, it's like, oh, I'm ready to die. I've seen everything, that kind of thing. But that's just like the expression of, man, this is like the one thing in the world that I really wanted. Now that I have it, like I'm good to go. That's really what he's saying there, and I think it's pretty cool to live a life where you have like accomplished so much that there's just like that one thing that's left, and then you're happy, you're good to go. I think that's kind of the goal of, a lot of people when it comes to living and dying on this earth. So we continue on. So this is where Pharaoh Joseph gives them the advice about handling livestock and then what to say. And so that's what it says here, because every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. And then verse 4 or chapter 47, they have this conversation with Pharaoh. They tell him that they are shepherds, they have no pasture for their flock, and Pharaoh says to Joseph and his brothers, "You can have whatever land you want. Let them live in the land of Goshen, and anybody else who they need to help take care of livestock, they can use." And so he sets them up, and he asks Jacob, "How old you are?" And he's like 130 years, and he's like, "I haven't lived as long as my fathers have, but here I am." And then Jacob blesses Pharaoh, and Pharaoh goes out, and they and then the family go settle in Goshen. Now, here the story kind of go. So most people agree that like the story kind of goes back a little bit to build up what Joseph had been doing during the famine. So what else he's been doing during the famine in terms of collecting power. So you have like the famine severe, his family come out of Canaan, they come and this whole thing has happened. What about the Egyptians? With the Egyptians, when the famine was going on, it says first that Joseph collected all the money that could be found in Egypt. And then after all the money's gone, they're asking for food because they're dying, or they've paid and they can't pay anymore. And so Joseph said, "Okay, give me your livestock." And so he takes their livestock, and that's where like this like extra livestock comes from. That's now in Goshen that belongs to Pharaoh that Joseph needs people to take care of. He's collected like the livestock from the rest of the Egyptians. So in that sense, even the Egyptians, like if they see the family of Joseph settling in the land of Goshen, getting that great place to live in where they could take care of animals and livestock and stuff like that, they can't even really get jealous about that even as well, because like, oh, why don't we do that? Because they not only do they abhor those kinds of people, but even if they didn't, they've already given up all their livestock for food. They traded. Like, first they've given up all their money. Now they're giving up all their livestock. So they don't even have that. Everything belongs to Pharaoh. And so it says, nothing's left except our bodies and our land. So why would we die? Let us buy us and our land for food. So they're willing to turn themselves into slaves to Pharaoh and give up their land so that they could get seed to live. They just want to plant and keep growing and keep living. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh because the Egyptians, each one sold his field for the famine, overcame them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. And he made the people slaves from one end of Egypt's border to the other. And so this is significant because it's going to set up what happens next with the end of the story. So we're going to have like Joseph's story and Jacob and everybody else close out, and then you get to the book of Exodus. And for those of you that are really familiar with the Old Testament, the story here, you know that they eventually the people of Israel become slaves to the people of Egypt and to Pharaoh. And what's happening here with the consolidation of power through Joseph is what enables Pharaoh to make the Israelites his slave. So Joseph is buying land and he's taking over ownership of the Egyptians themselves. So he's establishing the idea that Pharaoh can own people, and he owns all the land now. And so he buys all. So what is going to happen is, in a future, Pharaoh is going to utilize this change in their structure in the society and use that to enslave the Israelites later on. And so Joseph unwittingly is, he's growing the power of Pharaoh, which is what he saw in the dreams and the visions, and what he told Pharaoh you should do is set up somebody who's going to be in charge of all the food, and then slowly, like, you're going to accumulate power, become wealthier and wealthier and stronger, in your power over the people. Because you can see people here, they own their own land and stuff like that. And only after this do they now have to give a fifth of what they make to Pharaoh. So it seems that, whatever taxes or whatever Pharaoh got, now it's like so much more and than what he was getting. And so the famine has really set up the situation for Pharaoh to dominate the Egyptian society with his power. The only land that he couldn't take was the land of the priest, because the priest had an allotment from Pharaoh. So Pharaoh, in other words, the priesthood was exempt from all of this. Pharaoh gave them food because they're his priests, and so they get to keep their land. They don't need to trade anything to buy anything for food. They already have an allotment of food, and so they don't have to sell their land. And if you remember, Joseph married the daughter of a priest. So in all that as well, he's going to be able to inherit, presumably, with his sons, land also. So he's kind of like setting himself up and setting Pharaoh up, and then setting up his family to be the only landowners in all of Egypt, which is pretty crazy. But it's definitely a play that he's making for power. And so he does that, and then the story ends with the people being thankful that they at least can eat. And so it says again, only the priest's land had become Pharaoh, and Israel settled in the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen, acquired property in it, and were fruitful and multiplied greatly. And so that's how this week's Torah portion ends, with the nation of Israel settling in. So the 70 that came with Israel, they're all settling into the land of Goshen. They get land and they start to multiply and grow greatly. And we're going to see in future readings what ends up happening there and leading to Moses and the 10 plagues and needing to get out of Egypt. Now our prophet portion comes out of Ezekiel chapter 37, and the theme is again about reconciliation and restoration. And so what we have here in Ezekiel is, hundreds of years later, you have the Assyrian captivity has already happened. The northern kingdom existed independently from the southern kingdom. This split happened after the reign of Solomon, because of his sin and his giving over to idolatry and 300 concubines and offering uh, sacrifices to Moloch. You can read it in 1 Kings chapter 11. God tells Solomon, I'm going to take 10 tribes away from you, and you're just going to have yourself and the Benjamin, and then like the Levites will kind of be independent. So, but it's pretty much it's just going to be Judah that's going to be the southern kingdom, and then the northern kingdom is going to have the other 10 tribes in it. And that was again a consequence of his sin of idolatry. And the first king of the northern kingdom was a man named Jeroboam. And what Jeroboam did was he set up high places or altars in the mountains and everything else in the northern kingdom, because he was worried that if the people went to Jerusalem to worship at Solomon's temple, that their hearts would be like, oh, you know what, we shouldn't be separated from the south, and we should be one, and that they would join then the southern kingdom. In order to keep power, he created places for the people to worship in their own land, so they wouldn't go down there. And he had the 2 golden calves, which come up again, and so they start to worship, and so they become idolatrous, and so the northern kingdom falls into idolatry, in this pattern of idolatry and disobeying God a lot faster than the southern kingdom. Southern kingdom had a few kings here and there, like Josiah and Hezekiah, that would reform the nation, and it would buy them more time. So first the Assyrians would go into the northern kingdom and conquer the land of Israel. And the way that they conquered people was they would take people and displace them into other nations, and then they would bring the other nations and other lands where they had also conquered and bring them into the land. And their goal was to just intermarry everybody, so that they would lose their national identity. So you'd no longer be like, oh, I'm an Israelite, I'm from the tribe of Dan. Like, they would just end up getting moved around and scattered and mixed in and start. So eventually people would just be like, yeah, I'm Assyrian, and they would just accept that and not fight or revolt against the nation. And so the nation of Israel, just the northern kingdom, just kind of got assimilated that way over time. And then the southern kingdom was conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, and Babylon, and so what we have there is a different approach to conquest. They would exile or bring to Babylon the best of whatever country they took over, and that's we get stories of Daniel and how he was moved into Nebuchadnezzar's palace, and while they did that, they kept people separate. They didn't try to intermingle, and so the Judah, in that sense, was able to keep their national identity. In the At the end of the book of Ezekiel, you have these prophecies about the restoration of both kingdoms. And in this passage specifically, it says, "The word of Adonai came to me," it's Ezekiel speaking, saying, "You son of man, take one stick and write on it for Judah." So God is telling Ezekiel, I want you to present an object lesson to the people. And so what you do is get one stick, write Judah on it, or for Judah, for the children of Israel joined with him, and then take another stick and write it for Joseph. And so this represented the two kingdoms that had separated and been separately conquered. Joseph is associated with the northern kingdom because his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, were the two primary tribes of the kingdom, like the ones where like a lot of control and power coming out of, and so they're really identified with the northern kingdom, Ephraim and Manasseh, or Joseph. And so that's the northern kingdom. And for Judah, the southern kingdom, you got two sticks with both these names written on them. And then he says in verse 17, "Join them to one another for yourself as one stick, so they may become one in your hands." He's like, put them together, tie them together, probably like with some rope or whatever, and put them together. And so when the people see it, verse 19 says, "Behold, I will say to them," they're going to ask you, "What does this mean?" You say, "Behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel, joined with him, and I will put them together with the stick of Judah and make one stick, and they will be one in my hand. The sticks that you write on will be in your hand before their eyes." Some people, I certainly feel like it's intimating that there's a kind of a miraculous thing happening where Ezekiel will tie these things together and hold it, and then they'd actually become one stick, which is obviously like a really cool visual. Like in terms of object lessons, like if I could do that kind of thing, I would have it set up right now. It's like it's kind of magic trick. But the point is, God saying like right now they've been separated, but I am going to bring them back together. But like we saw in the passage in this week's reading, we saw a reconciliation, a restoration, a reunification between Joseph and his brothers, and it's Joseph and Judah, right? That the relationship that's put back together, it happens with those two at the forefront. In verse 21, we get more context. So when is this going to happen? God says, "Behold, I will take the children of Israel from the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them from every side and bring them into their land." And remember what I just said about how the Assyrians conquer. To be able to get the children of Israel back out of the nations where they've been gathered is going to be truly like a miraculous thing, to be able to gather them all back together. Because we can do DNA testing, and I know they do that now with Israel as people want to go back to Israel, and they could do a DNA test and say, "Oh, what percentage of Jewish lineage you have," and so on and so forth. And certainly that's kind of happening. But the idea of gathering together everybody from all the nations where they've all been scattered. Jesus talks about this, about the angels going out to the four winds of the earth and gathering the elect back together. It's similar, the idea that he's going to gather them together and bring them back into their own land. So again, when is this going to happen? When it's going to happen, they're going to have one nation, they're going to have one king, and there no longer be two nations and never again be divided into two kingdoms. And he's going to save them from their dwelling places. He's going to purify them. They will be my people, and I will be their God. My servant David will be king to them. So the language now is pointing to the final kingdom. That's what this is pointing to. They will have one shepherd. They will walk in my ordinances and observe my rulings and do them. And so the idea of like the Messiah, son of Joseph, we talked about, I think it was last week, the one who suffered, is betrayed by his brothers, and then suffers at the hand of his brothers, is the picture of that is completed in this week's reading, where not only does he suffer at the hand of his brothers, but then he also forgives them for causing his suffering, and then enacts a plan so that they can be tested and then pass the test and then be restored back in their relationship with the brother they betrayed. And so that's the idea of like the Messiah, son of David. So the Messiah, son of Joseph, is supposed to do that. Is supposed to be the one who suffers, but in his suffering, is the nation is kind of gathered in that, and then the son of David is the one who comes in conquering, is able to bring everybody back together, and he's the one that rules. Again, this is according to like the Jewish eschatology and their understanding of the final times of you interpreting passages like this. For believers of Yeshua, we see Jesus as being the fulfillment of both Messiahs. And so as we read passages like this, we see it as Jesus' second coming, where he comes back. He's going to be their one shepherd. Certainly Jesus talks about this in John chapter 10, that I am the great shepherd, that he is going to bring them back, and that he will rule, and that he will gather them together, and that they will have a covenant of peace with God, that he's going to create that covenant with them, that he's going to set up his sanctuary among them. And so therefore the imagery of like what we see in the book of Revelation, where heaven comes down, there's a temple. The end of Ezekiel has a description of this final temple. The book of Revelation has a corresponding description of this final temple. And so it says, I will be their God and they will be my people, and the nations will know that I am the Lord that sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. So all the rest of the world, all the other nations are going to see all of these things happen. They're going to see the reunification of Israel in a really miraculous way. And then they're going to see the dwelling place of God come down from heaven and establish itself in Jerusalem. And then the nations will know, like, oh wow, their God is the God of the universe, the God of everybody. And they're going to know that he has specially chosen Israel, and he's going to he's going to finish this current time that we're living in and start a new era, a new age in which his son reigns. And it also does fit in with Christian theology and Christian eschatology. Now there have been attempts to replace Israel with the church and it's called replacement theology, and it's an error of thinking. I would definitely say that. I think plan of salvation for Israel and the plan of salvation for the Gentiles. Paul talks about this, and he talks about how the nation of Israel had to first reject him so that the God can reconcile with the rest of the nations, with the rest of the world, and then bring back this relationship, or reconcile again with his people, as prophesied here. Actually, what I was like a little confused about why the New Testament passage was from Luke chapter 6. So it starts here in Luke chapter 6, verse 9. It says, Yeshua said to them, I ask you, is it permitted on Shabbat, or the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil? Let me pull this up because I forget sometimes. Yeah, it's not on the screen. So again, Yeshua said to them, verse 9, I ask you, is it permitted on Sabbath to do good or to do evil, or to save or destroy life? Then looking around at everyone, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. The man did, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed among themselves what they might do to Yeshua. What's this passage about? How is it connected to the Torah passage? Well, if you didn't figure it out, remember, Joseph concocts a plan to test his brothers to see where their heart is in terms of their relationship with their father and their brother. Jesus here is putting forth a test as well. He wants to know how these followers of God, these children of Israel, how they feel about their father and about their fellow brother. And with this test, what we see is they fail. With Joseph and his test for his brothers, they pass the test. Judah says, you know what? I'm going to step in and take the place for my brother. I'm going to lay down my life for him. Like Jesus said, that's like the greatest sign of love that one can have for another, is to lay down a life for his friend. Here, Jesus puts down a test, and he says, what's the greater, more important thing to do on the Sabbath? Is it permitted to save a life, to do good, to do evil? It's a test for them. It's a test to see where is their heart at? Where is it at? And he heals the man. He stretches out his hand. He heals this man. his hand is restored, and they're filled with fury and discussed what they need to do with Yeshua. And just a side note, like because some commentaries like, well, it's like permissible to do this, this type of healing or this type of miracle, this type of thing, and healing this guy's life doesn't really save a life because he says that Jesus, he asks him what to do good, do evil, to save or destroy a life. There was a code of teachings of what to do exactly on the Sabbath and how not to violate it, and saving a life was important and was one of the exceptions to the rule. And some commentaries like, well, saving this guy's arm really doesn't save a life because he wasn't dying or anything. But you have to think about the like kind of like the social weight of the idea of like a man working. If a man works, he's earning money for his family, he's taking care of his family. This is an important thing. A man whose hand is withered, you think about it, what's he going to do for work with one arm? Most likely, people are like, yeah, just go over there, sit and beg. Most likely, that's what he would have been doing. And by restoring this guy's hand, he's giving him a second shot at life. He's giving him a chance to go and work and earn for his family and take care of himself and not have to sit and beg. A lot of people assume that all beggars love doing it because they don't really need to, and they just want to because they make more money doing that. And sure, in the U.S. we have panhandlers, we have people, articles have been written about this kind of thing for a long time, about people that make $60,000-$70,000 a year just walking, traveling, and panhandling and collecting the money, and not really needing to, just because they like doing that and it's easy for them. But then there are also those who are forced to beg. They can't walk, they can't function, they're mentally disabled or whatever, and the best they could do is ask someone to help them with little money so they could buy food or whatever. Like, I'm talking about those who are honestly hurting. And I think this is the kind of situation we find this person in. And again, it's a test by God, test by Jesus for his people to see where their heart is in regards to their own brother and their love for their father. And it seems like they really just love themselves more, because once Jesus saves this person, they immediately start planning what they to do with him. The rest of the passage also kind of confused me. I was like, what does this have to do with the rest of it for sure? And it says, because we're supposed to go to verse 16. So it says, and it was during those days that Yeshua went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent all night in prayer to God. And I thought, oh, that's connected to Jacob, right? He was wondering, okay, am I supposed to do this? What, supposed to go down to Egypt? Like, so he goes to Beersheba and he offers sacrifices and he prays. And we have to assume that Jesus is like, okay, they failed the test, Father, so what's next? And one thing that, when you read the gospel, the older I've gotten, I realize how much Jesus went to prayer to ask the Father, okay, what's the next step? Because he knows what the end is supposed to be. He knows what he came for. But throughout his time on earth, there were always these moments where there were tests being presented to the people to see where their hearts were at. And then, okay, where do we go from here? What's the next step? What's the next step? Each healing, each miracle, each event that happens was done with a purpose. It was done with a purpose. And so after that experience, he goes to pray. Okay, what's next? What's next is when day came, he called his disciples. So he had a group of people following him. And from those disciples, he chose 12. 12 is significant because it's 12 tribes of Israel. Right, so he picks out 12 emissaries, 12 disciples, 12 to go ahead and begin the next part of his ministry. And what is the next part of his ministry? It's the ministry of reconciliation with the people. It's to go out and reconcile the Gentiles with the world, because he knows what's going to happen is they've already rejected him. And so now he's got to train these 12. One of them is going to be the one who betrays him. But he's going to train these 12 knowing that the path is now set towards the cross. They've rejected him. And one of the themes that you see repeated throughout the Gospel of Luke is, and he set his face towards Jerusalem. knowing that going to Jerusalem was going to be going to the cross. And so he knows that his path now is going towards that end. And so now for the next 3 years, what he has to do is he has to train these disciples, he has to train these men to continue on the ministry that he's going to have for them once he dies, resurrects, and ascends back to the Father. And the ministry is going to be a ministry of reconciliation, something that Paul says here in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He says, now all these things are from God who reconciled us. I know I always got to make sure I check here. Okay, here we go. So in verse 18, chapter 5, verse 18, now all these things are from God who reconciled us to himself through Messiah and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. That is, in Messiah, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and he's entrusted the message of reconciliation to us. We are therefore ambassadors for Messiah, as though God were making his appeal through us. We beg you on behalf of the Messiah to be reconciled to God. He made the one who knew no sin to become a sin offering on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God. So Paul is laying out what he's also gotten from the Lord, in terms of like what are we here for? What is the training for? And this is what Jesus was training his disciples for. What Paul just described here, the ministry of reconciliation. And honestly, it's part of what you and I are supposed to be trained for and be doing as well. Which is why we study the scriptures and we learn and we see how we're supposed to be doing that kind of stuff. And then in the book of Romans, as I look for that, because I put together some other passages as well. But in the book of Romans, chapter 11, in verse 12, we see, says, now if their transgressions lead to riches of the world and their losses riches for the Gentiles, then how much more their fullness? And what Paul is talking about is the rejection of Israel of Jesus, of Yeshua. And again, the replacement theology is that the church replaces Israel and the covenant and all that stuff. It's not at all what the scripture teaches us, and it's not at all what God wants for his people. And Paul explains here how Israel's rejection of Jesus is part of God's plan so that God can reconcile with the rest of the world. A lot like how Joseph understood that him being sold into slavery was part of God's plan so that he could save the rest of his family. That's all kind of connected here. God knows, okay, this one thing's going to happen. It's going to be bad for them, and it's their choice, but he's going to use their agency and their choice to accomplish a goal. Right? It was their choice to sell their brother into slavery. God allowed that to happen. God could have intervened. God could have sent an angel down there and pulled Joseph out of the pit and say, no, you're not doing that, or given them a dream, or told Jacob, hey, listen, he could have done so many different things to stop that from happening, but God allowed it to happen. God says, I know what's in their hearts. I'm going to let them go in that path. I'm not going to stop them from hurting their brother Joseph. What I will do is protect Joseph and make sure that his brothers are then saved through this whole thing. His brothers and their families and their kids and everything else. With Israel, it's the same thing. God knew that they would reject him. God knew, what's going to happen. There's a test. What do you want? Oh, we hate this guy. We're going to kill him. Jesus goes back to the Father. What are we going to do? Okay, we need to get together 12 disciples. 12 emissaries who are going to do this work of reconciliation, because their rejection of me is going to lead to the reconciliation with the rest of the world, the time of the Gentiles. And so in verse 15, I also highlighted, for if their rejection leads to reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So what Paul is saying is, so the moment that they do accept is going to be the moment of life, resurrected out of the dead. And that's where it's just like where you thought Israel was lost, you're going to see life come up. And that's actually referenced back to like Ezekiel chapter 37. We looked at the two sticks being joined together, but before that, there was a whole prophecy of the dry bones, the valley of dry bones, and these dry bones coming back to life, and sinews coming back together, and just life being formed out of what was dead. And in the book of Zechariah, you have at the end of that book prophecies regarding the restoration of Jerusalem and Israel, and how they will see the one whom they pierced, the one who had suffered, and they're going to mourn what had happened. And certainly for those of us believers, I think I mentioned this last time, we see that as Jesus, the one who they're going to look up and they're going to see him, or they're going to recognize him. They're going to recognize him as the one that they pierced, and they're going to mourn. But God has a plan of salvation for them through that second coming. And so the whole concept kind of ties together there into the ministry of reconciliation and forgiveness and restoration, and how all that works with Joseph and his brothers, and how we're kind of like, we look at it now, the Gentiles being reconciled to God. That ministry is ongoing, and it can only happen because Israel has rejected the Messiah. What's going to happen is once Israel sees the Messiah and they accept him, things will change in terms of how the relationship between Gentiles and nations functions with God. That's all in the book of Zechariah. I don't have time to go into all that, but I encourage you to read Zechariah in the last couple of chapters there, in the mention of, looking at the festival of booths and how that's celebrated, and what Jerusalem's going to be like, and where the elect are going to be, and how the nations have to go, and everything else. Alrighty, so that's where we end with this week's reading and study. What I wanted to do, I don't want to take too much time, because I know I'm not too late. It's about 50 minutes. We're close to an hour, but I do want to just cover these concepts of forgiveness and reconciliation, and just clarify some things about that. I personally believe, and I think that the research supports this as well, that forgiveness can be had without reconciliation or restoration of relationship. They don't have to go hand in hand. Now, ideally, in terms of a relationship being fully restored, obviously you want those two things to come into play. You want to forgive, and you want to reconcile, you want to restore relationships. But not all relationships are worth reconciling or being restored, or they're not even safe enough to do so. If you have an abuser who is, like, let's say someone who sexually abuses somebody else, let's say it's a child and a parent, which is the most common connection between the two, is a child and someone they know. It could be a parent, an uncle, it's usually family members. The numbers point to, the whole stranger danger thing is not being as prevalent, nearly as prevalent as it is with family. And so if you have a family member who's abusive in that way, and they abuse children, and it's found out and discovered, okay, so what do we do here? Right? We hold them accountable. We have to. That's not happening a lot in families. A lot of times what's happening is we're sweeping things under the rug. We're trying to hide things. We're trying to act like it didn't happen, or even tell the child it was their fault somehow that thing happened. Okay. And so what happens is these children grow up, and then they come into classrooms like mine, and they're like, well, I start talking about forgiveness. I start showing verses about forgiveness, like how Jesus said that forgiveness must happen in order for us to be forgiven. Looking at Matthew chapter 6, at the end of the prayer that Jesus teaches his disciples to teach, one of the lines is, "And forgive us our debts as we also forgive our debtors." In verse 14, Jesus says, "For if you forgive others their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your transgressions." They hear verses like that, and they're like, wow, so I was raped by my uncle, my dad, my aunt, whatever it might be. I was abused by them, and so I'm reading these verses. People are reading verses to them about how they have to forgive, and they're having a hard time with it. And they look at this other verse also. It's also in Matthew. It says, "But you, when you pray, you go to your inner room, you shut your door, you pray in secret. Your Father in secret will reward you." And again, the whole idea, if we forgive other transgressions, your heavenly Father. It's just the same verse now in the Gospel of. That's just in Matthew. So I had that again. And I meant to have Matthew chapter 18 here, Matthew chapter 18, where we have the question where Peter asks about forgiveness, right? That's what I meant to have here. So that's why I was a little confused by that. So it says, how many times do I forgive the same person? And Jesus says up to seven times 70, and all this kind of stuff. And then he tells this parable about the one who owed so much money. And at the end, his point was, about about the other one not forgiving, and he's like, you've been forgiven so much, you should also forgive. That should drive your willingness to forgive. So also my heavenly Father will do to you unless each of you from your hearts forgive his brother. And so you definitely have these teachings where it's like, well, you have to forgive, you have to forgive, you have to forgive. But what about reconciliation and restoration? Do those things have to happen together? And it's there where I have to stop people who say yes, or that forgiveness is incomplete if there is no restoration and reconciliation. No, that's like a manipulative tactic to try to protect abuser. That's where like power and abuse rest in this idea where, oh well, it's your duty, he abused you, but it's your duty to forgive him and reconcile and be okay with what happened. And that's where, like, in our minds, we know, in our hearts also, we know there's something wrong with that. But we see verses like this and we're like convinced, oh, we have to forgive, or I won't be forgiven by God. And you have to then say, like, we have to come to grips with the idea and the truth that it just doesn't feel right, because it isn't right. Right. So how I teach this, and how I believe this should be understood and be taught in other churches as well, in other places, is that while forgiveness is required, reconciliation is conditional. We always talk about love being unconditional, and what that means is, you love people, you're committed to them, you decide to love them, and you're committed to that love, whether or not the feelings are good. And you're committed to the idea of love and self-sacrifice, and I'm going to lift this other person up. I could commit to this person no matter what. Affection, though, is conditional, right? Like whether or not I love VAW and I hug my wife, and I give her a kiss or whatever. Sometimes that is affectional, or something she does for me and I really appreciate it, and I give her a hug, or I do something for her and she gives me a hug. That's affection can be conditional. It's okay, because it's just a sign that you care about somebody. You shouldn't always be forced to show affection, and sometimes the feelings aren't there, and love is there. The commitment to put them above you is there, but the feelings of affection, sure, they can be conditional at some point, and we can understand why sometimes we don't have those feelings. There's a disconnect, and so you spend time together, and then the affection comes back, and so on and so forth. Reconciliation is also conditional, and Joseph's story, I think, perfectly highlights that for us. Forgiveness isn't. Forgiveness is required, as we've looked at. But does forgiveness mean I have to reconcile with the person who's caused me harm? And it really does come down to whether or not this relationship is one that's safe enough to be in. And that's what Joseph did. Joseph looked at his brother Judah, he looked at his brothers, and he said, okay, I've forgiven them. He said that when he named his son Manasseh, and he said, that means like I forgive him. Or is it Ephraim? I forget now which one, but it's one of those names meant that he's releasing the debt. And that's what forgiveness is. You release the debt of what you feel someone owes you for the things that they've done against you. And so for Joseph, he felt that. He decided to do that when he had his first son. He said, I'm letting go of the debt. What I feel like my brothers owe me, seeing my family here now and having my son, I'm letting that go. I'm just going to enjoy this life that God has given me and these children that he's given me, and I'm good. He did that. When his brothers come back into his life, he doesn't immediately say like, oh, hey, it's me, Joseph. No, he puts together a series of events to see if his brothers are safe enough to reconcile with and to restore his relationship with them. He wants to know where their heart is at. He wants to know how they really feel about him, how they feel about their dad now, and if they love him actually, or they're just really just looking out for themselves. And so he puts together a whole test that we looked at earlier about, his brother Benjamin and everything else. And Judah, what does Judah do? He steps in the place of his brother, says, I will become a slave for him. And so in seeing that, Joseph realizes, wow, they've changed. I'm going to reconcile with them. And so the first two times he cries, he hides his face to do that because he doesn't want to reconcile with them yet. He doesn't know yet if it's safe enough to do that. But with the third time he cries, he lets it all out, and he lets them know who he is, and he's willing to reconcile with them and he tells them how he was able to forgive. How is he able to forgive? Because in perspective of God's plan, he's able to accept what happened to him as part of God's plan. And so that's how he's able to let go of the debt that he feels like they owe him, that he is going to forgive them and move forward from that event that happened, and that now he also wants to reconcile with them. And so for those of us who have been abused by people and been at the hands of abuse by others, we very honestly, it's good for us to forgive, because when we let go of that debt that we feel like other people owe us, but we also let go of his anger, we let go of vengeance, the need for revenge, the need for something bad to happen to that person. We let go of all that negative stuff, which really just like becomes bitterness in our hearts, and will turn us against ourselves and others as we hold on to that. I call it becoming Batman, just the vigilante who can never forgive, never let go of his need for vengeance, and he's just chasing after one villain after the other his whole life. And you look at it plays out, he's just by himself always. There's chances for love, there's opportunities for relationships, but he can't do it. It's in like the cartoon series Batman Beyond, he has to like clone himself so that he could have someone to pass on his legacy to. Because even like Robin and all that stuff, like nobody could stay close to him is the point, because he's just always seeking vengeance because of what happened to him with his parents being killed when he was younger. You don't want to be that. You don't want to be in that position. And that's where forgiveness is actually for us. What Jesus is teaching, and the whole thing there, like forgiveness is about us releasing debts and allowing God to be the one to deal with what people might owe him. And how he's going to deal with that is either the cross is going to be the place where they're forgiven and how they can be reconciled to God, or there's a whole other set of eternal consequences that are for people who reject the cross of Christ. And so, how do we reconcile? How do we restore it? That's conditional. If like with my dad, by the time I forgave my dad, he was living in a halfway house, and I actually witnessed a family member do it first, and then I was like, I want to do it too, because like if she could do it, I'm going to do it. And it really helped me just like get rid of that thing I was carrying on with myself, like this need for him to suffer or to say sorry. Even like, no, he didn't do any of that. He was talking about Ronald Reagan and aliens and playing golf and just random stuff. And my cousin did it, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to do it too. And I forgave him also. And that was the beginning of my life changing, in that sense where I was like holding on to depression and anger and just regret and all the pain I went through in my life as a child growing up and my teenage years because of all the stuff he did. I was able to let that go. Did I reconcile with him? Did I have a relationship with him again? I thought about it, prayed about it. I was like, well, it's he's just not a safe person. And before I could really like make a decision about it, he died. And what about situations like that? Do you reconcile with people who die, who have hurt you in the past? Like, obviously we can't. Uh, uh, I could go to his grave and visit him and talk to him and stuff, and I've gone a couple times, but it's the need to like reconcile that relationship in any kind of way. It's not something that I feel like is important for me, and but the forgiveness is, and I did that, and I'm able to move on. But the reconciliation and the restoration of relationship, we get to do that case by case. We get to decide whether or not it's safe enough to do that, because some people you can forgive them. Okay, I forgive you. You reconcile with them, restore the relationship, and then they hurt you again. And that's the kind of thing we have to stop the cycle of. We can't keep letting people hurt us. We forgive them, we bring them back into our lives, and they hurt us again. Where's the accountability in that? That has to stop. That's a cycle of abuse that has to stop. And so those pastors and those leaders and those parents and those everyone else, those abusers that have over the years taken advantage of the teachings about forgiveness, they need to be, set aside and say, okay, listen, if we want to reconcile, we need to restore. Like I said, it can be conditional. With let's say with my wife, let's say she offended me in some way, I could say, I forgive you. I'm good. Like, I don't need anything to be done to reconcile or to restore the relationship. Sometimes, you want flowers, you want candy, you want an expression of affection to make up for the act of sin that hurt the relationship, and that's perfectly within your rights to do that. But I really do think, like, as we grow in maturity, we're able to forgive and reconcile with the people that we know are safe in a free way, where we're just like always kind of forgiving and reconciling without needing anything to be done to for those things to happen, because we know our daily faults and struggles are there. The abuser, though, those who harm intentionally, and scripture is full of passages about how we're supposed to separate those people from our communities, and we forgive, but then we just let them stay. And if there's going to be a process of restoration, it belongs to those who have that ministry and responsibility as being more spiritual. I think Galatians chapter 6, which covers that as well. So I hope that all makes sense. If you have any questions, comments, please reach out to me. Let me know. Thanks again for watching and following along with the study with me. And you can, again, just like or subscribe to the video, whatever, share. But most importantly, just share with people that you know like to study the scriptures and like to kind of go in more in depth than they might normally do. And I have been thinking about maybe doing a video where I kind of go through my study process, because I'm realizing there are a lot of people who are reading, but then just like they're kind of lost in terms of study. And it certainly helps to have like a background and history of training with certain things. So it helps me to connect things faster, but ultimately it's the Spirit who reveals and teaches us all things. And so I think what's more important is to learn how to allow Him to do that. And so I'm looking to put together a video where I kind of show how that can work in the future. Alrighty, so I'll see you again next week. I'll be posting this week's readings probably on Friday night or sometime on Saturday. Remember to read the passages at least 3 times, if possible, in different translations. If you don't have multiple translations of the Bible at home, you could always go online to like Bible Gateway or download an app, and they usually have tons of translations there. Read the translation that you're most familiar with. So if you've been reading King James Version your whole life, read that. Then read something that's totally different, like the Message. Well, it's not really a translation, but maybe like the Christian Standard Bible. The New Living Translation is a good one. That's kind of like the Message, but not as informal. And then read something like the NAV or the ESV is another good one, a more modern English translation. And so you kind of get, it helps your brain to see passages differently, words differently, so that you can start to notice things that stand out to you, and then that leads to learning and teaching as well. So 3 different translations, the 3 different times you do the reading, and then start taking notes. Don't take notes right away. Just read, and then take notes. All right. So I'm going to end there. Thanks again for watching. Until next time, God bless.